Alison woke up one morning to find that her hair was soaking wet. She checked herself for a fever but found none, and neither had the heating been left on all night, as she sometimes did, because the sheets were quite dry. She stood up on her mattress and jumped up a couple of times to touch the ceiling, but found that the neighbours above hadn't flooded their bathroom. And then, seeing that she was late, she went to get changed for work.
"Going out with wet hair in this weather?"
said Mr. Michaels, her neighbour, in the corridor as she bumped into him on the way out. "The world won't stop turning because I've washed my hair. How are you today, Mr. Michaels?"
"My dear, at my age, all you can hope for is to forget. It won't get any better."
Alison's day did get better, as she managed to finish all the work that her boss gave her before noon, and she spent the rest of the afternoon just catching up with friends and family on the internet. After work, she accepted the offer of her colleagues, for once, to go for just one quick drink. And she ended up coming home before midnight. She flopped down on her bed and found the pillow to be reassuringly dry. And she slipped off to sleep, waking up in the morning with her hair once again soaking wet and her fingers holding something. Nervously, she peeled back her fingers to reveal a piece of moist clay. She grabbed her phone and stood up on the bed. She looked under the mattress. She opened the wardrobe doors, and she checked every room in her small apartment, but didn't find any intruder. Who could be doing this to her? She made a mental list of ex-boyfriends, but for all their faults, she couldn't think that any were quite so psychotic as to do something like this. And anyway, the door was barred and the windows were locked. Alison was moody and thoughtful all day at work, and her colleagues assumed she was probably hungover from the night before. And when she came home from work, she found Mr. Michaels waiting on the landing of the first floor. In fact, she wondered if he came out every time that he heard the front door open and close. He was out of breath from carrying his shopping up the stairs.
"Hello, dear. Yeah, it's funny. You still think you're 21 until you climb a flight of stairs. Yeah, it's only when I look in the mirror in the morning that I remember what an old fart I've become."
The evening dragged for Alison. There was nothing on TV, and she found herself reading the same page of the book 2 or 3 times over. Finally, she went for an early night. But before she fell asleep, she set her phone alarm for midnight. If she was losing her mind, at least she might find out when she was losing it. She lay down on the bed and just allowed herself to focus on the sound of her breath coming in and out, washing up on the shores of her mind and mingling with the sounds of engines. Engines? She opened her eyes to find herself lying on a pile of bodies, her hair dangling into the water of a riverbank and her hands dug inside the clay mud there. She raised herself to find that there were piles of bodies stretching to either side along the shore as far as the eye could see. And behind her was a tall white wall of white light raising up as high as the sky. And more people were walking out of this wall of white light and laying themselves down on top of the other bodies. "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Alison looked up to see a boat pulling in, with a man in a white vest and a cigarette sticking out one side of his mouth as he tied up the rope. I hope someday you can join us, and then you'll do your fair share of the work. Oh, awake are you? Well, come on then. These boats won't load themselves. Alison played along. It seemed like the best way to play for time. And she helped the sailor pick up the sleeping bodies and carry them onto the boat. When the last body had been loaded, she jumped aboard. The boat blew its steam whistle and set off for the other side of the river. The other sailors soon lost interest in Alison and the other bodies, and they sat around smoking or playing dominoes. And Alison only realised just now that some of the bodies were naked. Others just wore dressing gowns or pyjamas. And every now and then they would pass another boat coming out of the mists, also laden with bodies. They passed beneath ancient stars, and she was dying with curiosity to find out where they were going, and she was about to ask some of the other sailors when she saw the other bank emerge, covered in mist, pink and yellow and green, purple, waves of mist all merging together. They arrived on the other side, and the bodies began to rouse themselves and walked off the boat onto the shore and into the thick, colourful clouds. Alison started to follow them, but she felt a hand on her shoulder and met the sailor, who said, "Time's up, love. You don't want to miss the boat, do you?" Alison allowed herself to be guided back on board, and soon came walking more people, sleepers out of the mist, setting themselves down upon the floorboards of the boat. The whistle blew, and they set off once again for the waking shore. Once they arrived, the sleepers once again roused themselves and walked off into the wall of bright white light, and Alison followed them. Beep, 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 beep. It took Alison a full minute of staring at her phone to realise where she was. Outside, she could hear some drunken students going home after a party. She walked into the kitchen and made herself a pot of hot coffee. She longed to call somebody. The last thing she wanted to be told now was that it was all just some kind of dream. Not daring to sleep again, she sat up against the wall, holding her knees all night, drinking the coffee to keep her awake. Until it was finally time to get changed and go off to work. But everything she did that day had a strange kind of time lag. Whether it was running for the bus or opening her computer, she felt almost as though she was doing it for the very last time. She had a feeling this must be what prisoners on death row experienced. And when she came home after work, she found Mr. Michaels struggling with his keys in the lock of the front door of the building. "Hello, dear. You don't look like you've slept a wink. Bad dreams?" "Something like that, yeah." "Well, I wish I could tell you they'd pass, but truth is, I've been having the same dream for 40 years now. My wedding day. There we all are, in the church, all dressed up to the nines. Priest is there, and organ music's playing, family gathered, all waiting for the bride to come. Only, she never does." "Mr. Michaels, did that really happen?"
Sleep well, dear.
Alison let herself into her apartment. She emptied the dishwasher, she changed the sheets on the bed, and cleared away her clothes strewn around the floor. She lay down on the bed and fell asleep at once. Sweet dreams are made of this. Who am I to disagree? Alison sat up at once, looking at the face of a middle-aged woman on whom she'd been lying, and ran over to catch the rope that the sailor threw over to her. "Oh, we'll make a worker out of you yet." They carried the bodies on board, blew the steam whistle, and set off for the other side. They journeyed beneath the ancient stars, and arriving on the other side, Alison was the first off the boat, walking into the mist. And pink and yellow clouds began to wrap deep around her, mist so thick she could hardly even see her own nose. She walked for the longest time, until she found herself taking her seat in an enormous hall where the only sound was that of scratching pens. And looking around her, she saw 100 desks and students bent over, writing furiously. It was her end of school exams, and she hadn't revised. Oh God. She couldn't answer any of the questions. If only the teachers would let her step outside for a moment to examine her notes. But she knew they wouldn't allow that. And anyway, they were mean and armed with pepper spray. Pepper spray? Surely that was illegal. Anyway, she wasn't 16 anymore. She'd finished her exams years ago. At this realization, a piece of plaster fell from the ceiling. The walls started to shake, and then the ground beneath her began to give way, falling in large chunks, until Alison fell through the floor. And she found herself tumbling down through the sky, head over heels, the air blowing tight against her. And looking down, she saw the ground approaching, maybe a kilometre away, approaching all too fast. She clawed and clutched against the thin air, and she found herself mumbling, "Sweet dreams are made of this." And it occurred to her that perhaps falling was a choice. And wouldn't it be so much more fun to fly? She stretched out her arms and, slowly, her descent changed into a controlled glide. And then she drifted up, flying through the clouds, bursting out into the sunshine. She swooped down again and landed on a mountain peak, the snows shining pink with the rising sun. And looking out upon the dreaming, she felt an enormous bubble rise up in her chest, full of unexpressed hopes, unfulfilled dreams. And with a smile going from ear to ear, she dived down once again into the dreaming. Soon she was charging through a desert canyon on a black stallion horse as a desert bandit queen, her band of 40 thieves following fast behind her, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Then she rode on the backs of giant red dragons that could burst out into space and eat stars for lunch. Then she became a dolphin, living in the Pacific blue, hunting down schools of tuna and surfing on the waves that arrived to the beach. Then she became the ocean itself, rippling and rolling and bursting upon the land. Finally, after countless dreams and fantasies and adventures later, she ruled as the Empress of the universe. Her subjects would throw themselves down upon their face, tears of gratitude streaming down their cheeks, just to catch a glimpse of her, whilst angels sang her name from floating cloud beds. And she ruled in an enormous palace with high crystal towers. And yet something was wrong. She stepped down the crystal steps into her gardens thick with the smell of jasmine flowers. And up rode a centaur, half man and half horse. "Something is wrong. Bring me the wise man." The centaur galloped off and returned moments later with a little monk on his back, with a shining bald head and dressed in red robes. He dismounted and bowed low before the empress. "Something is wrong. What is it?" The monk said nothing, but produced from his robes an enormous full-length mirror, which he held up for the empress to gaze into. And as she looked inside, she saw a rather ordinary-looking woman in her 20s, walking through the mist. And she remembered. Then none of this is real. At her words, she heard a creaking sound, and then an enormous crash as the crystal towers behind her collapsed down to the ground. And the palace itself fell down, producing enormous clouds of dust and debris. Thick clouds of mist began to roll in, and she found herself walking out of the mist, back onto the waking shore. And in your dreams, whatever they be, dream a little dream of me. Oh, you're back early. None of it is real. Blimey, you worked that out fast enough. Took most of us ages to get bored. I just want to go home. Yeah, look, it's a bit late for that now, love. I want to go home, and you can't stop me. All right, have it your way. Alison got back on board and waited for the other dreamers to emerge from the mist to make the journey once again across the river. And arriving on the other side, she walked back off into the bright white light and emerged once again on the shore. She ran once more inside, but burst out again just as quickly. She looked up at the sailor. I did try to warn you, love. You missed the boat. Look, the important thing, right, is to stay busy. Maybe you can work with us. I'll have a word with the lads. Alison spent the longest time after that just riding backwards and forwards across the river. She wondered who would have found her. Would her boss have noticed when she didn't come in from work and called the authorities, or would he have just fired her? Maybe one of the neighbours found her, maybe even Mr. Michaels. She would later ask herself if she had seen him first and then thought about him, or the other way around. But there was no escaping the fact that Mr. Michaels, wearing an old pair of yellow pyjamas, was snoring heavily on the deck just across from her. And as the boat pulled in to the other side, she knew exactly what she was going to do. Walking behind Mr. Michaels with one hand on his shoulder so as not to lose him in the mist, she walked off into the dreaming. Green and yellow and blue clouds began to wrap thick around them, and they walked through the mist for the longest time, until she heard the sound of church music. And she went off to change. Mr. Michaels found himself dressed up in his suit there at the front of the church, not daring exchange another nervous smile with the priest who kept looking at his watch. Family and friends gathered there in the church all looked suitably awkward, staring down at the floor, and indeed Mr. Michaels wished that the ground would just open up and swallow him. The organ grinder played Here Comes the Bride for the 7th time in a row, ever more desperately, but then seemed to pick up a new life. And, not daring hope, Mr. Michaels looked up down the aisle to see his love approaching him in a dazzling white wedding dress, a smile across her face, and her look of adoration, of unconditional love, washed over him, and he felt a lifetime of sadness begin to melt and dissolve inside him as he knew what it was to be chosen, to be loved. And so a new life began for Alison. For those of us lucky enough to meet her, she scares away the monsters in the forest. She hands us clothes when we find ourselves naked in public. And when we're falling, she catches our hand and teaches us how to fly.